Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 2nd of December. I'm Fraser Nelson. In this week's show, is the NHS really the envy of the world? Kate Andrews says the health service is actually falling apart in her cover story for this week's magazine. She'll be on to explain. Also, new research shows that people were protected from COVID before the virus was ever created, apparently because of their exposure to the common cold. We speak to the scientist behind that study and ask what relevance, if any, this has for vaccine manufacturing. China is leading the world in hypersonic missile technology. Is that something for us to worry about? Does it work in the first place? And is China winning in the new Cold War? We're going to be talking to Andrew Cockburn about his theory of why we shouldn't, after all, worry about China. And then Christianity in the Middle East. Janine di Giovanni spent 30 years reporting from war zones where she noticed the steady erosion of Christianity, especially after the dictators were toppled. What went wrong? She'll be coming on to discuss. And finally, we'll be looking at the music of the Beatles, the Beach Boys and Bob Dylan and asking, did these three artists influence each other, and if so, how? Ian Leslie reviews a book about that for this week's magazine and discusses the musical overlaps you might not have known existed. But before we get going, if you haven't subscribed to this YouTube channel, then please do. It's absolutely free. All you need to do is click on the red subscribe button underneath the screen. If you click the wee bell, then you'll be alerted to every time there's a new episode. And if you don't subscribe to The Spectator, we'd like to make you a special introductory offer. For just £12, you can get 12 weeks of the magazine, 12 weeks full digital access, and a 20 quid Amazon voucher. If you do the maths, you work out that our marketing department has made a mistake. It doesn't stack up, but you might as well take their money. You go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. In our cover story this week, Kate Andrews asks if the NHS is fit for purpose. She rather suggests not. She joins me now with Matthew Taylor, who's Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation. Now, Kate, Britain's been through a pandemic. We're bracing ourselves for whatever the consequences are of the Omicron variant. Of course, the health service is going to be stressed and strained. So why do you think that there's something more fundamentally wrong going on?
Well, as you say, Fraser, the pandemic has knocked not only the NHS, but essentially every developed country's healthcare system throughout the world. So, of course, it's going to be more strained. It's going to be in a more difficult state. But the truth is that the idea of a winter crisis is not unique to coming out of a pandemic or being in a pandemic. These are the usual headlines that we would see for the NHS nearly every winter for quite a long time now. The idea that you would pull the lever to cancel elective surgeries is also not new. We've been talking about that in the wake of the pandemic, the fact that in some areas they're being cancelled again, but that happened in 2018 because the healthcare service could barely cope. So what I'm highlighting in the article for the magazine this week is that yes, every country has had a very difficult time with COVID, and the strains and the extra demand as more patients who weren't seen last year are coming forward this year is going to be adding to that burden, although it's an important burden because those people should be coming forward. But the major difference is that we have known for decades now, when we look at international comparisons, that the NHS has been struggling. It's often ranked mediocre. It is far from the envy of the world. So I think now, coming out of COVID, hopefully, goodness forbid something should change on that front, this is the time that we need to start seriously talking about what the other options are. Not looking to the USA, which is usually the default, NHS versus USA, but looking to the rest of the developed world that also offers universal access to healthcare. But the emerging data does seem to be that many of those countries fared better in the pandemic and are faring better coming out of the pandemic.
Matthew Taylor, when you were working for Tony Blair, health service was pretty much half what it is now. It's gone from 8.1% of GDP to 13% of GDP for overall health spending. If money was going to be the problem, wouldn't we have the best health service in the world? I suspect even you wouldn't be as bold to say that we do right now.
No, I think our health service, and there are lots of different ways of measuring this, but it's probably overall funded slightly less well than similar health services. And it achieves outcomes which vary. In some areas they're quite good, in other areas they're not so good. So I think it's important not to believe that our health service is perfect, or even that it's, to quote a phrase, world-beating, to recognise its strengths, but also to recognise that it needs to change. But it is very important to recognise that rising health costs is a global phenomenon, and particularly in developed countries which have ageing populations, because it is indeed the ageing of the population, which is the big driver of health and care costs. I don't think there's anything intrinsic to our NHS model, universal healthcare, free at the point of delivery. That I don't think is what is wrong with the health service.
It's common to every country pretty much, isn't it? Every country in the developed world, apart from America, is free at the point of use.
Yeah, I think when we look at what we need to do with the health service to get it back on its feet, I think first of all, it is important to recognise that between 2010 and 2020, we had the decade with the lowest growth in health spending that we've ever seen in the health service history, around half the trend increase in health spending that you tend to see in countries because, as I say, of that ageing population. And the consequence of that was a health service with fewer nurses per head, fewer hospital beds, fewer doctors per head than most other countries like us. And a system like that, a system that runs on hot most of the time, is particularly vulnerable to external shocks. And that's why COVID has had a particularly challenging effect on our population and on our health service.
Right, but Matthew, that figure I quoted, 13% of GDP, that's higher than any country in Europe, any country in the world, except the United States. I mean, you cannot really say that Britain lacks for health spending because we literally spend more as a share of our economy than anybody else beside the US.
I think if you look at public health spending, we rank below the average in the EU 14. We're just about average for the OECD. So you can look at this from various perspectives. Is it public spending? Is it private spending? Is it total spending? I don't, in a sense, the question of, as it were, this kind of existential question of whether or not the health service works, I'm not sure where it takes us. There is no public appetite for changing the core principles of the health service. Any attempt to do that would be massively disruptive, which is the last thing that we need now. I think instead we need to focus on the practical challenges that the health service faces, and also, and this is critical, the opportunities which are going to be provided by digital, by data, by med tech. Those offer the opportunity to make a real difference to our health service in the coming years. And I think that's really the thing we should focus on. How can the health service take advantage of those shifts to achieve a step change in the quality of its service?
So Kate, the health service is reasonably funded and it's doing a reasonable job.
Well, look, I think we can measure healthcare spending in all kinds of ways, but percentage of GDP spent on healthcare has often been the way that people look at it. And one of the reasons is because if you go back, say, a decade, the NHS was relatively average in the OECD. So that was a convenient metric to say that the issue is more money, we need more funding. That's always the go-to. Whenever the NHS has a problem, we simply say we need more funding. Now, this has changed quite radically and recently because Boris Johnson, after putting NHS pledges on the side of a Brexit bus, has really decided to double down on that, try to make the Tories the party of the NHS. And so far, he's not doing that with reform. He's doing that with money. But in 2020, the metric that is so frequently used to look at healthcare spending does put the UK second highest in all of the OECD. So those countries that are often cited for having better funding, Germany, Switzerland, France, that also get better outcomes, have fallen behind the NHS on that metric. And if we look between 2010 and what we estimate by 2025, the healthcare budget, the NHS budget, will have gone up by 42%. And I think if we look at something like schools, it's roughly 3%. In the next election, the day-to-day public service spending is going to be roughly 44% of the whole budget. We're getting quite close to having a healthcare service with a government attached. And I think it's very important, crucial, that in these next few years, given the fact that we have the system we do, we focus on getting those resources to the front lines and to supporting the doctors and nurses who are trying to help patients. But we cannot keep funneling money into what is so clearly a broken system. And the money that we were spending in 2020 just doesn't seem to, on the preliminary data, have gotten us the outcomes we would have wanted. Let's go back to lockdown last year. Look at the oncology appointments for cancer patients. In Germany, they dropped by 33%. That's a stark figure. But in the UK, they dropped by 60%. If you look at Swedish breast cancer patients, those that were being seen dropped by 10%. In the UK, it was 30%. With the money we were spending last year alone, we should be doing better on these metrics. So in the next few years, yes, by all means, let's try to be efficient. But we clearly have more to learn from other systems. And I think we need to stop being so blinded as to what they're doing right. Because as Matthew says, that principle of universal access to healthcare is so deeply important. But for the person waiting for their ambulance to show up who's losing hope, or for the person who still can't see their GP, free at the point of use is losing its relevance. The NHS is not there for them, and surely that is really the point, to get people access to care.
Matthew, what do you make of that point then, that non-COVID care during the pandemic was far worse hit in Britain than it was in other countries? I mean, Kate said that cancer care, for example, took a way bigger hit here than it did in Sweden. If you look at knee operations, hip operations, they went down far more here by about 45-50% than they did in Ireland and Italy, where they went down by about half of that level. So why is it, in Denmark they actually went up, so why is it other countries are able to carry on their non-COVID care, when in Britain we've seen that knocked for 6 and a waiting list of something like 5.6 million people?
So this is why it seems to me that bold statements like, the NHS is broken, the NHS doesn't work, doesn't really get us anywhere. It's kind of a level of generality which is fine for political posturing, but no good when it comes to actually practical steps. So why? Well, the simple reason is the way in which we run our health service has been to minimise the number of beds. Statistics are all over the place at the moment because of COVID, but one thing that was pretty commonly seen about our health service was that it was a pretty efficient health service, even if some of its outcomes were not what we would want them to be. If you talk to doctors even before COVID, and you talked about the occupancy rates we had in hospitals in the summer, people in other countries, continental Europe, would be amazed that we would have occupancy rates of 80% plus in the summer, when, in other countries this would have been unheard of. People would be taking holidays. There'd be a lot of give in the system. That's not how we run things. We run things so that, we do have difficult winters every winter. We do get people out of hospital as quick as we can. We do have high occupancy rates. So when a crisis like COVID happens, there is no slack in the system. That's the way that our system has been designed.
That's right. Is that a good thing, do you think? I mean, it sounds to me like a pretty bad thing that we run it bad for doctors, bad for patients. Every winter we seem to be in a crisis. Yeah. I mean, surely there must be a better way. I mean, look, going to Europe, it doesn't happen to the same degree. Now, you're saying, yes, it's efficient if you look at the proportion of beds that are filled. But that seems to be a rather strange way of defining efficiency. If you define it for patient care, for example, if you define it in terms for patient outcomes, surely that's way more efficient than what proportion of the beds are filled. And isn't it the NHS way of doing it, maximising the bed occupancy, rationing healthcare? Hasn't that become the problem?
So I think if you look at the way in which the NHS has been resourced over the last few years, one of the problems has been feast and famine. We saw a lot of extra money go in under New Labour. I think looking back, not as much reform, not as much progress should have been made. A lot was made. By the time Labour left office, we were meeting those key targets for waiting lists, emergency departments, elective care, making real progress. We then move into these 10 years of austerity with spending increasing at less than half the annual global increase in developed countries that you expect in the health service. What that has led to is major capacity issues. So we have major capacity issues in terms of the capital of the health service, hospitals in a very poor state of repair, not made the investment we should have made in areas like digital, and of course the number one problem right now, which is workforce. We did not plan sufficiently, we did not invest sufficiently. And now actually we've got a situation in health service where in the short term at least there is the cash, but people don't know how to spend it because we don't have the workforce, because it takes several years to put that workforce in place. And yet even now we are pressing the government to publish more regular workforce plans, and there's a pushback against that. Why is there a pushback against that? Because if you publish workforce plans for the health service, it comes with a price tag attached, and the government does not want to see that price tag in the public domain. So it isn't just about the level of resource. Unfortunately, we've gone through this feast and famine, and that has left us in a position when COVID struck, where our capacity in areas like capital and areas like workforce was not where it needed to be, and we've suffered as a consequence.
So, Kate Andrews, Matthew Taylor is saying it comes back to resources. There was not much health spending during the austerity years. We're now looking at the consequences of that decision to slow down, and not exactly cut, but slow down on NHS spending when we should have been investing. The result, the disaster that we see now.
Well, to be very clear, the NHS budget was going up in real terms every year. It was just that it was going up perhaps less than others would have liked to see it go up. And I think a lot of this also comes down to priority about where the money that has been funneled in actually went to, whether or not it went to management or whether or not it went to the front line. It's very clear that some of those priorities were perhaps in the wrong order. I think Matthew's highlighted very well that this is a system that is intentionally designed to run hot. The way you argue you are efficient is to not have spare capacity, to not have spare beds, to not have spare workers, to always be operating on the brink. And I think COVID highlighted a lot of things. Number one, do you want a healthcare system that does that? But number two, with the NHS logo being used to convince people to stay home, protect the NHS. As I mentioned in an article, a senior source on the health side, on the NHS side, said, test and trace had nothing to do with us. They wanted to use that NHS logo because it's so powerful. That kept a lot of people home. Now they're coming back. The demand is rising. I still don't think the resources are in the right place. But this should make us question overall whether or not this is the kind of system that we can live with for the next pandemic, because if our freedoms are really tied to NHS capacity, it's going to be a rough life for all of us in the coming years, because as I mentioned at the beginning, NHS capacity is an issue every winter, not just with COVID. Then after that, I think you have to go back, frankly, decades, look at these international comparisons, and while we are all quite rightly talking about the value of life and what we all did on and off for the past 2 years to protect life, to respect individual life, we need to look at the fact that if cancer patients were treated in other countries from 4 of the most common types of cancer in, say, Germany or, say, Belgium, thousands more lives a year could potentially be saved. In short, the system really does matter. So this is a time, if you really want to protect that principle of universal access to healthcare, if you want more resources for the NHS, if you would like to see it better funded, and it is going to be better funded from next year with the Health and Social Care Levy, if you actually want to see that money put to good use, you have to address the system, and that's going to have to come from Whitehall, from the people in charge, and they're going to have to be courageous, because for a very long time, politicians simply have not been able to criticize the healthcare service. It has become a national religion, but it is one that is not doing us any good.
Kate Andrews and Matthew Taylor, thanks very much indeed. Now, when COVID first came along, there was talk that if you'd had a common cold, you might be protected from it. At the time, it was seen to be a pretty out-there theory, but research from University College London suggests there might be something in this after all. Professor Mahdad Noursadeghi joins me now. Professor, tell us about your research.
Yes, thanks for the invitation to come along and talk about this. So I'm part of a large research collaboration called COVID-Sortium. And when the COVID-19 first emerged in early 2020, it was already becoming apparent very quickly that many people experienced asymptomatic or very mild disease. And we thought that a possible determinant of this particular outcome, so a reason why some people might develop asymptomatic or mild infection, is that they might have very early immune responses that stop the infection from taking hold. To be able to find these very early immune responses, we would need samples from participants at risk of infection before, during, and after exposure. And to do that, we had to start really early and be able to collect samples before the wave sort of spread through the UK. And we were able to start our study at the very beginning of the first lockdown in London by recruiting some 400 healthcare workers who were particularly at high risk of being exposed in the very first week. And then follow these people up over time to see who would become infected and try to identify those who might be exposed but be able to resist that infection. And what we found is that in a subset of people, probably about 1 in 10 that we were able to study, showed evidence of an immune response to the internal machinery of the virus that would stop the virus from taking hold or as an infection. And what's really interesting is that this immune response to the internal machinery really relates to components of the virus that are very highly conserved between different coronavirus species. And if we could harness this sort of immune response in vaccines, then that would give us the opportunity to develop a a pan-coronavirus vaccine, or at least a vaccine that was much more resilient to new variants emerging.
Are we talking about a T-cell response here, a T-cell mediated response?
Yes, that's right. So the immune system, as you'll be aware, involves several lines of defense, and there's been lots and lots of discussion of antibody responses to the virus. And antibodies are the primary target of the main vaccines that are currently available. But the vaccines and natural infection also induce a T-cell response. And T-cells do two sorts of things. They either help the body produce antibodies or indeed can seek out and destroy virally infected cells themselves. So they make for a very important part of the immune response. And what we found is that the subset of individuals had T cells that could recognize components of the virus that, as I say, were shared between many different coronaviruses.
And interestingly, you think they may have come by this T-cell immunity or T-cell memory by exposure to the common cold, of whom I think I'm right in saying about a quarter to a third of the common cold are responsible are due to coronaviruses.
Yes, that's right. So most of what we could describe as the common cold is due to coronaviruses. And the parsimonious explanation, the most likely explanation for why people at the very beginning of the epidemic wave in 2020 would have some T-cell immunity or T-cell memory is that this T-cell memory was generated by previous exposure to other coronavirus vaccines.
Right, now this seems to be a very important part of the corona puzzle. But there hasn't been much research on T-cells. If I want to find out if I've got antibodies, I can go down to a clinic round the corner, I can pay them 50 quid, they can tell me quite quickly. If I want to find out if I've got a T-cell response, how is that done? Is it more difficult to measure T-cells than antibodies?
Yeah, that's right. It is technically more difficult. And one of the reasons that antibodies are easy to measure is because we can measure them in a fraction of a blood sample called serum that doesn't need much laboratory processing and can be easily collected and run through assays. To find these T cells, we need to collect the cellular fraction that requires much more laboratory work up front before we can do an assay. And the assays are more difficult because the frequency of these T cells makes up for a very small fraction of the total T cell population. And so we've had to develop assays that are super sensitive so that we can identify these T cells.
So could you give us some, in crude terms, if it takes a matter of hours to do an antibody response, how long would it take you to test one person for T cells?
So actually, once you have an assay that's developed, then the actual measurement is quite straightforward, and we can do it within 24 hours.
Really? Because we haven't seen very much in the way of T-cell. I keep you fairly abreast of these things. I haven't seen very much in the way of T-cell testing or studies which ask, for example, let's take a blood sample of people taken before COVID-19 came on the scene. How many of those people have got T-cells? I mean, the La Jolla Institute in California came out with an estimate right at the beginning of the pandemic where they looked at blood samples taken before COVID, and they found a surprising number had COVID-relevant T-cells. But since then, it hasn't really been part of the conversation, I assumed, because people thought the T-cell argument didn't really hold water.
That's correct, because you're absolutely right. It hasn't certainly been in the public eye so much, but actually in the sort of research community, there's been a huge amount of work done on T-cells. One of the great difficulties has been to prove that these pre-existing T-cells were actually responsible for protecting people from infection. And the reason that our study was helpful was because the study design that captured people before, during and after the infection allowed us to really show that clearly, that actually these pre-existing T cells were expanding in response to the exposure to infection and blocking the infection from taking hold.
So is there any estimate of how much of the population actually had some degree of T cell protection before COVID-19 came on the scene?
Yeah, we don't know that. It's really, really difficult to prove that experimentally because the collections are not necessarily available, and nor the sort of outcomes of what happens to everybody is necessarily available. These sort of studies are not really possible to do now because so many people have been exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus or else to vaccinations that also will induce T-cell responses.
Right, but back last year, for
really
example,
to test
Public
this
Health
properly
England
going forward would need us to integrate these components into a vaccine and then look at the efficacy of the vaccine.
Right. So if I want to find out if I've got T-cell immunity, is that possible? Can I do that?
In research projects, that's certainly possible. I know of commercial sort of efforts to develop these assays as a commercial test, but their real application in sort of routine clinical care is not very well defined at the moment. And at the moment, it's rather speculative exactly what it means for an individual person. I think going forward into the future, particularly as if we're able to incorporate components of the virus in next generation vaccines that are really targeting T cells, then I think they'll come to the fore much more.
But let's look at the vaccines we've got right now, the mRNA viruses like Pfizer, Moderna, even the slightly old school vaccine from Oxford's and Astra. They solicit antibody responses, but they also solicit T-cell response, don't they?
Yes, that's right. But the responses that they generate are uniquely to the spike protein that is encoded in the vaccine. And the difference between that sort of T-cell response and the T-cell responses that we're describing is that the spike protein is extremely variable and can be mutated much more readily than the internal machinery of the virus that is required for the virus to undergo its life cycle. So the important thing is really to think about the next generation of vaccines that include more than just the spike protein, to include these internal components of the virus that can't vary so much.
But they do that already, don't they? I mean, most vaccines available will give you a T-cell response of the sort that you're talking about.
Yeah, so this is the really crucial point. The existing vaccines only generate immunity, antibody and T-cell responses to the outer shell of the virus called the spike protein. The spike protein is very variable, and new variants will mutate its spike protein to be able to escape the immunity generated by the vaccine.
So you think it's scientifically possible then to develop a vaccine that will target not the outer shell but the core of the coronavirus? So there ought to be a way that will come up that will protect us against not just the existing variants but all future variants, in the same way that the people you discovered with T cells from exposure to the common cold are protected. We can give you that sort of mutation for all variants of coronaviruses. Is it scientifically possible?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, that's exactly why we're really excited about these results, is because they give us the best evidence so far that targeting other parts of the virus can be protective, and these other parts of the virus, the internal core as you described them, do not vary as much as the outer shell, and therefore they will generate or potentially generate more durable vaccines.
So how do you do this? Can it be done via mRNA vaccines of new generation, or is it simply a new way of just simply old school exposing people to the antigen, hoping the immune system does its magic?
Yeah, they can definitely be encoded into the new generation of vaccines. The new mRNA vaccines, for example, we would just use sequences that lead to the production of these core components of the virus rather than the spike protein. In fact, a more mature way of thinking about this actually is that the next generation of vaccines might include many components of the virus encoded by the mRNA. So the same technology can be tweaked to be able to present different parts of the virus within the vaccine.
Okay, and if for sort of timescale, has this been done before? I mean, I'm trying to work out, is this something which is theoretically possible but might take 10 years in the same way that people have spoken about, for example, HIV vaccines, theoretically possible, but they're still not with us?
Yeah, I mean, 2 years ago, I would have said that this would take several years to develop, but now I'm pretty confident that's not the case. The real transformation as a result of the pandemic has been our discovery that we can accelerate vaccine development to such an extent to really reduce it within 6 to 12 months, I think. I imagine that if it becomes apparent that new variants are indeed escaping vaccine-mediated protection, that will be enough motivation to focus everyone's mind on the next generation of vaccines, and we could probably turn that round in the next 3 to 6 months.
The next 3 to 6 months. And you're aware of anybody looking at this? I mean, there's a very big world out there looking at new vaccines the whole time. Is somebody looking at a T-cell mediated inner core vaccine for COVID?
Yeah, our group is not involved directly in vaccine development, but really identifying the components of the virus that we can incorporate into the next generation of vaccines. So yes, there's ongoing conversations and have been for some time with people who are involved directly in vaccine development to do exactly that, to develop that next generation, including other parts of the virus rather than just the spike protein.
Okay, and finally, is there a time limit to this? Because one of the things we've noticed, certainly with the mRNA vaccines, is that the efficacy wanes over time. The Israelis found this quite strikingly, but the very high protection levels 4 months later were much lower. Is that because they were targeting the outer shell? I mean, are you talking here about a vaccine that would not need to be topped up every 4 to 6 months? Or is that somehow a factor of mRNA?
No, I think that vaccines that primarily try to prevent infection happening at all probably are all susceptible to waning immunity because the antibody levels drift down slowly, and that's what's probably the first barrier to an infection taking hold. But if you imagine the other purpose of vaccines is to prevent severe disease from happening, then the durability of vaccines is probably much better to prevent severe disease. We also think that vaccines that generate good T-cell responses are probably more durable than those that just generate good antibody responses. So I think as we go forward, the focus will probably change slightly to develop a strategy that prevents severe disease rather than necessarily a strategy that just stops all transmission of infection from happening. Nonetheless, it's probably quite likely that we'll end up with a vaccine or an approach to vaccination that involves boosters at intervals, not unlike, for example, annual boosters for flu vaccine.
Professor Mahdad Noursadeghi, thanks very much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, next up, do you remember the reports last month about China developing a new hypersonic nuclear-enabled missile that was able to circumnavigate the world and strike? It turns out we were told that American intelligence were quite surprised by how advanced the Chinese technology were because they were more advanced than the Americans themselves. In this week's magazine, Andrew Cockburn cast some doubts on this, arguing that the West has got a little bit carried away with how advanced China might be. He joins me now, as does my colleague Cindy Yu. Andrew, why aren't you worried about this? Because the Chinese obviously do have the technology. So what's to say that they have not actually overtaken America and Russia with this new hypersonic glide technology that everybody is trying to develop?
Well, there's a number of reasons. They used to say the Pentagon talk about weapons that don't work to meet threats that don't exist. And this is a shining example of that. First of all, there are inherent reasons why a hypersonic missile, which I should quickly say simply means something that travels at more than 5 times the speed of sound, is not a very sort of worthwhile weapon of war, because the whole point is that it should glide along. It's boosted into orbit by a rocket, just like any space vehicle, but then is released just at the top of the atmosphere and basically given an almighty shove by the rocket, and then flies through the atmosphere toward its target, maneuvering, flying like an airplane. As an airplane, in fact. And the whole point of that is that therefore it's impossible to track, to know where it's going to be. With an ordinary ballistic missile, once it's set off and you can see where it's going, you know where it's going to be and you can intercept it, theoretically. And this gets around that. That's what's meant to be scary about it. Except that we don't have any defenses against ballistic missiles anyway. They've been trying for years. They spent $200 billion since Ronald Reagan unveiled the idea back in 1983, and they still have got almost nothing to show for it. They're still working on, still spending billions. So, there's nothing new. There's no new threat here. And by the way, in trying to reduce a complicated technological thing to brief sentences, in maneuvering through the atmosphere, the thing quickly loses energy. I mean, it's like, in the act of sort of turning or diving or climbing, it slows down.
So Cindy, if it's useless, then why is the Chinese government spending so much money on it?
I think we have to look at where else in the world is doing it, because it's not just the Chinese and the Americans, it's also the Russians, as Andrew points out in his article. Putin has made this a key military facet since 2018, and the Chinese are following this. If you look at supersonic nuclear missile, if you search that in a Chinese search engine, most of the articles that come up are about how ahead the Russians are. So I do think we have to take that into account, that to China, great power competition isn't just about America, it's also about the other big beasts in the world. And Fraser, just to go back to your point before about Chinese military capability being better than the Americans, on ballistic and cruise missiles, they are, but just on that. And the reason for that is because of China's geography. It's surrounded by countries in a way that America is not, or countries potentially that you might have conflict with. And so it has concentrated on that part of its capability in a way that America doesn't have to. So on that point, it is better than Americans, but that doesn't mean the whole military as a whole is better than Americans. It still only spends less than a third of the US defense budget on its own defense, even though the army is much larger.
Andrew, isn't that a decent point? When you look at the world's great defence spenders, China's pretty small. I mean, your average NATO country is supposed to spend 2% of GDP on defence. Now, Britain does, France more or less, but most of them don't. But China is something like 1.7, so this does not look like a country which is really budgeting for conflict in the way that we tend to see in the build-up to wars.
Well, this is true. And in fact, I think it's the case, they still spend more on their internal security apparatus for keeping the Chinese people under control, the People's Armed Police and a huge apparatus of censorship and all the rest. They spend more on that than they do on their external military. So all this tub thumping that we see in the press, with like the hypersonic missiles we're discussing, should be seen in that context. It looks like they see a bigger threat from their own people than they do from any external enemy.
But what about the military build-up in the Taiwanese coast there? I mean, that can't be an internal threat. I mean, that's right now, but is the number one focus of American attention. And the understanding in Washington and in London is that China, if it wanted to, could make an assault on Taiwan pretty quickly. It doesn't need missiles for that. It just needs boats to go a few miles over the sea and annex currently sovereign territory.
Well, it's very easy to, once you sort of put all that in one sentence, it all makes it sound quite easy. But, they've got, we in 1944, the Allies took an enormous effort to move an invading army 20 miles across the Channel, or slightly more than 20 miles. But for the Chinese to go to Taiwan is 100 miles. They need more than 2 amphibious ships, which is all they have at the moment. Amphibious support ships. They probably might need more than 2. Well, I think they're heading for 4 aircraft carriers. I think one they converted into a hotel, but never mind. I mean, it's just a very silly idea. I mean, that they keep saying that we don't think we could do this. It's worth looking at what the Chinese say about themselves in the Chinese literature, and they keep sort of complaining that the troops aren't properly trained, don't know how to use the weapons, that the whole thing's been disorganized. They haven't done a major exercise since I think 2017. And as for these, incursions into Taiwanese airspace that we read so much about in the press, if you look at the map of where the planes actually went, they basically go along one side of this self-declared air defense identification zone, which is not national airspace. and fly along it, maybe one plane a day, sometimes many more, but most of the time one plane, then go home again. It looks more like training flights. In fact, the Taiwanese chief of staff said the other day that's what they were.
So Cindy, how do you see this? The Chinese people seem to take reasonable pride in the military. China still has military parades where the latest weapons are put on display here. I mean, do they regard military spending as a waste of money or something that an up-and-coming nation needs in order to stake its claim to be the kind of the power in the region? That certainly seems to be, as you've written before, this is what Xi wants. He wants to be the top dog in Asia. For that, he will need a military capable of projecting if he chooses to do so.
Yeah, Fraser, I think it is much more about national pride, and I think people are happy to spend this much money. And, you know, the dynamics that Andrew picks out in this military-industrial complex that happens in America happens in China too, because once you big up the threat coming from places like America, as a Chinese person, you're going to want to defend yourself from that. Or you want to protect your territorial claims, for example, in the South China Sea, or Fraser, you said Taiwan, which I would argue that the Chinese do see as an internal problem, as we know that they argue about that. So for things like that, either it's for defense or for securing your own interests in its near abroad, as it were. The Chinese are quite happy to spend money on that. And some of it is not, so the People's Liberation Army has been undergoing modernization. Some of it is not about spending more, it's just about spending more cleverly. It's about reorganizing, it's about spending less on the army, more on the navy, more on the space force. That sort of rejigging, which is something that President Xi has very much been looking at. But one thing that they've been lacking still is this kind of capability to have joint missions. So to take Taiwan, you need to have air, sea and land operating together. And at the moment, the Chinese are still not quite there yet with that. So you can see in the curriculum in military academies where they're still kind of figuring out what is the right approach to teach its students. So yeah, on that joint capability part, no amount of money is going to be able to fix that in the short term.
Cindy and Andrew, thanks very much indeed. Now, in this week's magazine, we review the latest book by Janine di Giovanni. She's been a war correspondent, now an academic at Yale University. She's written about the plight of Christianity in the Middle East. She joins me now. Janine, you've got so many stories inside you. Why did you want to write this one about the fate of religion?
Well, basically, I've been working in the Middle East for 3 decades. And around the time of Saddam Hussein in the early 2000s, I became aware of the Christian communities in Iraq. Now, these are people who are basically living in the land of the prophets, the land of Jonah, of St. Thomas, and how they were in danger of being eradicated entirely. Since the rise of the Islamic State in 2014, in places like Iraq and Syria, these communities who are very ancient, very rooted to their land, are even more vulnerable. So what I decided was really to focus on 4 very distinct communities in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, and in the Gaza Strip, and why they are so desperately important that these people remain in their ancestral lands.
Right. Now, of course, Christianity was a Middle Eastern export, so therefore it's been in the Middle East for way longer than it's been in Europe. So why should it be that after going through 2 millennia of tumult in these countries, it's under its most danger now, as you say in your book?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's very interesting because most British Christians and American Christians don't really associate. I mean, they know that Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, but they don't really associate the birth of Christianity being in the Holy Land, and that these ancient communities, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Copts, are such a unique part of biblical and indeed history. So really what recent events have led to there could be even extinction within 100 years. First of all, is the rise of radical groups. So let's take the Islamic State. One of their edicts was to basically wipe out Christians in that part of Iraq, which was, of course, Mosul and the northern villages leading into Kurdistan. The second thing, and I've just stressed that each community has their own individual challenges. So for instance, in Iraq, it's geopolitics, but it really also is climate change. Iraq is one of the most vulnerable countries in the Middle East in terms of climate change, but it's also about migration. a vast migration, that these young people, there's no industry, there's no incentive for them to stay. So every community has a very different story to tell. The Copts in Egypt, for instance, are extremely discriminated against. It's enshrined within the Egyptian constitution that they cannot hold offices of high position in the government or in the army, which of course is an arm of the government. In the Gaza Strip, it's an entirely different thing. There's only 800 Christians left there. And of course, Christianity, Gaza had been entirely Christian until the 4th century. So these 800 remaining people are basically sandwiched in between Hamas and the Israeli occupation. Even though the Israelis withdrew, they're still very much subjugating the people there. The 11-day bombing in May left Gaza devastated again. So each community has unique challenges that are allowing them to remain and indeed to populate, because their numbers are dwindling drastically.
But to what extent were the dictators actually a friend of the Christians? Because let's take Saddam Hussein, for example. His deputy, from memory, Tariq Aziz, was a Christian. In Syria, the Christians had an okay time under Assad. It was when Assad was on the ropes that they started to get worried. And even in Egypt, the Copts were pretty much, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but free to worship in peace until its recent regime changes. And only then do you end up with Christians in Egypt being attacked outside their churches. So I wonder to what extent the regime changes of the last 2 decades have ushered in the forces which have ushered out the Christians.
Absolutely. This was one of the stranger things that I came across. So you're absolutely right. The Christians were protected in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. There was a sort of unofficial deal with the devil that for their voting bloc, in exchange, they would basically be left alone. The same thing in Syria. And this is something that really shocked me, especially as I reported the war in Syria. When I would go to the Christian communities there, they would, basically state their absolute love for Bashar al-Assad. Now, whether or not this is a fear that they had to say this, or whether or not it's basically that they felt we'd rather have Assad than have the devil that might come afterwards. In other words, we do not want the black flag. Same with the Christians under Mubarak in Egypt, and then the ensuing chaos that led after the Egyptian Revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood. And as for the Gazans, they were probably the most closed community. It was the most difficult for me to penetrate that community, even though I've been working in Gaza since 1990. And I think basically most of the people said that Hamas did not bother them. What was more disturbing for them was their inability to leave Gaza to join their brethren in Bethlehem for Christmas or Easter, and the Israeli authorities prevented them from doing that. But absolutely, the link between Christians and dictators is very strong and very, very strange.
Right. And do you think that Christians, who would leave any of these countries could come to Britain and claim, under the UN definition, a reasonable fear of persecution? Because from what you'd say in your book, it's a pretty brave guy who keeps going to church right now in some of these areas where you become a target if you do so. Now, you also document in your book how they're leaving in quite in huge numbers. Ought they be going to Britain and America, and ought they be received because, perhaps because of interventions there a couple of decades ago? But they're no doubt under persecution now.
Absolutely. And I mean, so in 2016, 2017, when President Trump issued his Muslim ban on refugees coming to the US who were Muslim, that did not include Christians. Arab Christians. Now, remember, they're Arabs, but they're Christians. And for me, at that time, I was working for the UN Refugee Agency. It sent up a terrible message, which is that we have good refugees and we have bad refugees, i.e. good refugees being Christian. So Christian communities in Britain, in France, which is a Catholic country, in Spain, in Italy, and in the US, generally welcome. Canada as well is another big point where a lot of the Christians go, generally welcome these refugees, whereas Muslim refugees, especially now in the wake of the fall of the Taliban, are flooding Europe and elsewhere, and this has different considerations and concerns. Another thing is that the Taliban falling sends a terrible message for these Christian communities in the Middle East, because it basically means that other radical groups, and let's face it, the Islamic State might have been defeated, but they're not gone. They're regrouping, they're rebranding, they're recruiting under different methods. And there are numerous other groups that have been vastly empowered by the fall of the Taliban. So this leaves the Christian communities in Iraq, in Syria, in these other places, even more vulnerable, which is why we really have to draw attention to their plight.
And Janine, you met lots of these Christians, these people who risked their lives to show up to church. Did you get a sense of why they were doing it? Why not simply worship in private? Why would you risk everything that you've got simply to show up at your normal place of worship? If you're a clergyman, why would you keep doing that when you knew you'd be a massive target for somebody and you'd be safer seeking exile in a faraway land?
The answer that I got over and over was one word: love. All of them told me, for instance, when the Islamic State rolled through Mosul, the Christians that got out, some of them got out at the very last minute, literally with the clothes on their backs and their documents, but others stayed in Mosul. And the ISIS basically gave them a choice. You can convert, or we kill you, or you pay a huge fee. And they took their farmland and they put the letter N for Nazarene over their door, marking them as followers of Jesus. Now, I totally agree with you. If I was tossed into the lion's den as a Christian in the Roman times, I'm not sure I could have withstood the torture. But these people feel that their faith is what identifies them. It's who they are. And we're talking about 2,000 years of faith and of history. So what they would say to me, why do they remain? Why don't they go to Britain? Why don't they convert to Islam? Because of their love, their profound and deep love of their faith. They're linked to the land, and they're linked to their religion, which is of the utmost important to their identity.
Janine di Giovanni, thank you very much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now next, how much does the music of the Beatles owe to the Beatles, and how much does it owe to the Beach Boys, or for that matter to Bob Dylan? In a new book, Luke Meddings has written about the relationship between these three groups of musicians, and Ian Leslie reviews it for us in this week's magazine. He joins us now. Ian, this is a bit of a strange idea, isn't it? Nobody really thinks of the Beatles as being kind of, in any way, kind of Dylan epigons. But how plausible do you think the theory of symbiosis is between them?
I think it's very plausible. And yeah, it's an unusual idea because we're used to biographies of a certain artist, right? A book about the Beatles, a book about Dylan, and they might include some mentions of these other artists, but you're kind of focusing on one. And he's not doing that. He's saying, let's look at all these three artists, and in fact, he includes others as well. And let's look at the whole scene and look at how they interacted with each other and how they fed off each other and how they pushed each other to create this kind of incredible moment in the 1960s when these kind of giant leaps were being taken in popular music. So it's an unusual idea, difficult idea to pull off, but I think he does. It's a really, really enjoyable book.
Now, pretty much every biography of any musician will talk about their influences. I mean, Paul McCartney talks about how he heard Great Balls of Fire and it revolutionised how he thought about music. We see about Elvis learned from the gospel greats and created his own sound here. But what the book argues is that there was a kind of ongoing relationship between these three, that they almost felt in sort of competition with each other. And that's the bit I've got a little bit of difficulty with, that the Beach Boys thinking, oh, the Beatles are catching up with us, because you can't really hear much of a response to the Beatles and the Beach Boys music. At least I can't, but perhaps you can?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, because the influence isn't always obvious. You're right. It's not always kind of literal, because and that's kind of partly just a function of the fact that these guys are really great artists in their own right. So they're not just imitators. It's not like the Monkees. You know, God bless the Monkees, but the Monkees were setting out to sound like the Beatles, and that's what they did. It works a little bit different when you're Brian Wilson and you're a kind of, something of a genius in your own right. you're taking on board the influences, but you're transforming it as well at the same time. It goes through the prism of your own kind of artistic worldview. So he hears, Rubber Soul and by the Beatles, and he thinks, wow, I've really got to up my game. And it's not necessarily that the musical influence is direct. A lot of it is just the sense of ambition and of innovation and of trying new things. That kind of really pushed him towards the pinnacle of Pet Sounds and some of the other kind of great music that they made around that time. So, and I think Meddings is very good at tracing that kind of influence. He calls it adaptive influence.
Right. I guess you can argue that George Martin showed what musical production was able to do. And at that time, there wasn't just music, it was sounds that they were creating. And then Brian Wilson was a great one for creating sounds. And then he had basically these brothers who were just pretty boys going woo woo woo. But really, it was Brian Wilson who was a creative genius behind that. But you can see the Beach Boys music evolving in production values and the sounds that they were creating. You can't really see Dylan's music evolving in the same way.
Yeah, Meddings is really good at this because he pointed out a few things that I hadn't really kind of thought about, which is that Dylan's move towards a kind of a poppier and more electric sound was partly influenced by the Beatles.
Right.
And
you look at that famous point where he gave the concert and his fans were walking out when they heard the electric aspect of it coming in.
Yeah, right. And even before that, songs like Love Minus Zero, he was already moving in a kind of poppier, more, he started very folky sounding and he kind of moved towards a poppier sound and it became more of a band-based sound as well. It wasn't just him and his guitar. And that was partly him hearing the Beatles and thinking, wow, not only are these guys really successful, but what they're doing is actually quite musically sophisticated. So he was kind of inspired by it as well as impressed by their success. And so he was quietly influenced. He was not the kind of guy to admit it. The Beatles would own up to their influences and they would say, yeah, we love Motown, we love Dylan, and look, he's influenced us. Dylan would never do that. You would just see it in subtle ways creep into his music, but he would never say, I did this because I heard the Beatles and it really turned me on.
Right. And the Beatles, if you take back in the USSR, for example, that always struck me as being, not just influenced by the Beach Boys, but almost a pastiche of the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys will sing Surfing USA. The Beatles come back with Back in the USSR. The Ukraine Girls really knocked me out. It seemed to me that sounds like they're almost mocking the Beach Boys, but did they rate them? Did the Beatles go back and say to themselves, look, we think Brian Wilson is a creative genius and we've got to see if we can be inspired by the leaps he's making?
They did. They really rated them. I agree that back in the US, our Virgis close to pastiche, and you're like, are you just having fun here? But there's no question that Brian Wilson in particular, I don't think they actually rated all of the Beach Boys, equally.
Understandably, yeah.
But I think they really respected McCartney in particular. I had a real admiration for Brian Wilson. They became pretty friendly and talked a lot about music. So yeah, that was a real influence on them.
In your review, you mentioned there's a bit where Dylan hears the Beatles song Tomorrow Never Knows, and that is just way too psychedelic for him. And he's quite dismissive. He says, look, I get it now, the Beatles don't want to be cute anymore. Is that how he saw it?
I mean, I just think this moment is hilarious. They're in a hotel, because they meet, this is one of the interesting things, by the way. It's not just them hearing each other's records. They do actually meet in hotel rooms and clubs in New York and London over the years. And the Beatles meet one day one evening with Dylan. They play him a new track from their forthcoming album Revolver. It's Tomorrow Never Knows. It's this what must have been an absolutely terrifying, astonishing, mind-blowing thing to hear. Nobody had ever done this kind of psychedelic, one-chord, repetitive, mantra-like music before. And he gets to the end of it, and instead of saying, wow, that's amazing, or he just says, oh, I get it, you guys don't want to be cute anymore. And I just think it's the most kind of hilarious put down, but it also reveals his insecurity. I could tell, at the back of his mind, he's thinking, wow, these guys have taken it to a whole new level, and I'm feeling a little bit insecure about this, so I'm just going to make a little crack about being cute. But then, of course, he moves on as well. So yeah, they're kind of pushing each other forward, even as but they're friends and they're also rivals.
One of the things that I can't work out is why this process stopped after all the musical creativity of the 60s. You'd think that there'd be, between the years of like 64 and 67, for example, it goes on for all of you. The Beatles are coming out with inventing genres pretty much, playing music in every possible way it's imaginable to compose and play music. And then all of a sudden you get the 70s coming along where there is nothing other than a sort of a cabaret band called ABBA who seem to dominate the decade. So what happens to that kind of competition in musical ideas that seem to petered out after these three?
I would be a little kinder towards the 70s than you are, perhaps, but I do think that there was something special. I mean, Joni Mitchell, Stevie Wonder, Led Zeppelin, but I do think there was something special about that mid-60s moment. It was a real kind of golden age, and I think it didn't last long because the principal people involved just got exhausted. You know, they were working incredibly hard. They were the first huge kind of global pop stars, or, you know, after Elvis. But they were on a different level from anyone else. And they were touring all the time. They were recording all the time. And they basically burnt out. You know, Brian Wilson really went a bit mad and had a nervous breakdown and had to kind of take time out. Dylan had his motorcycle accident, but then it took a long time, you know, to rest and recuperate from that, because I think he was basically burnt out as well. The Beatles, one of the things that struck me actually from reading the book was, wow, the Beatles just kept going until they stopped, right? But they just kind of went straight through the 60s without stopping, and then kind of explode. So one of the things perhaps we underestimate them is their sheer persistence. And I think that was slightly intimidating for everyone else.
You can understand that the Beatles and the Beach Boys, you can understand that because they both really did experiment. But where is the influence of Dylan in the Beatles? Where's the influence of Dylan in the Beach Boys?
Dylan, less on the Beach Boys, I think, but on the Beatles, you can hear it in John Lennon's increasingly kind of confessional approach. You know, so Lennon in particular was really taken by Dylan, and he loved the fact that Dylan would just speak to you as if he was kind of bearing his soul about what he was really feeling and his emotions. And it was kind of great emotional directness to some of these songs, which was very in tune with where Lennon wanted to be anyway. But Dylan kind of gave him the confidence to be much more kind of forthright in that department. So for a couple of years there in 65, 66, you can hear Dylan really kind of changing the sound of the Beatles, perhaps more than any other artist.
Ian Leslie, thanks so much for joining us on Spectator TV. That's it for this week. You can read Ian's review and all the articles we've discussed in this week's issue, which is in the shops now, or you can try us for free if you want. You can go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer for our introductory offer. You get a 20 quid Amazon voucher and 3 months of the magazine. Thanks for watching, and thanks to our producer Max Jeffrey. Kate Andrews will be in the presenter's chair next week.